You know I always have a problem, Freddie.
Yeah?
And you have enough problems of your own.
No, I don't have any problems at all. As a matter of fact, I live like a king.
What the man America fell in love with, the golden boy of Hollywood's golden age, was hiding a truth so fragile, it could have shattered everything. For decades, Van Johnson lit up the screen with his boyish charm and effortless grace. But behind the dimples and the Technicolor smile was a life scripted by fear, silence, and survival. He played heroes for the cameras, but offset, he was fighting a role he never asked for. This isn't just a story about fame. It's about what it costs to be loved, when being yourself was the biggest risk of all. And once you know what he was really running from, you'll never look at his smile the same way again. Van Johnson, once dubbed Hollywood's golden boy, led a life that glittered with fame, but was shadowed by pain and secrets. Born Charles Van Johnson on August 25, 1916, in Newport, Rhode Island, Van's early life was far from idyllic. His mother abandoned the family when he was a child, and his father, a distant and cold man, left Van yearning for affection and understanding. That longing drove him to create his own imaginary world, a place where he could dream of stages, spotlights, and roaring applause. Determined to break free from the constraints of small-town life, Van left for New York City in the late 1930s with barely any money, but a fierce desire to make it in show business. Life in New York was harsh. He worked as a doorman, waiter, and bit player, barely making ends meet. But he never let go of his dream, tirelessly practicing his singing, dancing, and stage presence. His persistence paid off one night when Lucille Ball, then an up-and-coming Broadway actress, noticed him performing in a nightclub. She saw something magnetic in Van, his charm, his energy, his sincerity. Taking him under her wing, she introduced him to Broadway producers, helping him land small but significant roles. Those early opportunities, fueled by Lucille's belief in him, laid the groundwork for his career. Broadway taught Van how to move an audience, and soon Hollywood took notice. In the early 1940s, MGM, the most powerful studio in Hollywood, signed Van Johnson. Under studio head Louis B. Mayer, MGM shaped and packaged stars to appeal to mass audiences, and Van, with his red hair, freckles, and all-American smile, was ideal. When World War II began, many leading men joined the military, creating a vacuum that Van would fill. A serious car accident in 1943 left him with a metal plate in his head, making him ineligible for military service. Ironically, this injury became a career-defining moment, as Van stayed in Hollywood and starred in patriotic films that resonated deeply with wartime audiences. Movies like A Guy Named Joe, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, and the human comedy turned Van into a symbol of hope and courage. He became the clean-cut hero Americans needed, a young man who represented strength, kindness, and optimism in a world at war. But Van was more than just a war-era mascot. Determined to prove his versatility, he tackled a wide range of roles after the war, including musicals, romantic comedies, and dramatic films. In The Caine Mutiny in 1954, he played a morally conflicted naval officer opposite Humphrey Bogart, showing critics he had the depth and gravitas to handle serious material. He also thrived in musicals like Brigadoon 1954, performing alongside Gene Kelly, singing, dancing, and reminding audiences of his triple threat talents. Van wasn't just an actor. He was a full-fledged entertainer. Behind the scenes, however, his life was far more complicated. In 1947, he married actress Eve Abbott, just one day after she divorced actor Keenan Wynn. The swiftness of the transition raised eyebrows, and in later years, Eve revealed that the marriage had been arranged by MGM to protect Van's public image. Rumors about his sexuality had begun to circulate, and in the tightly controlled conservative climate of 1940s Hollywood, such speculation was considered career-ending. Louis B. Mayer, intent on preserving Van's wholesome image, orchestrated the marriage as a form of damage control. According to Eve, she was coerced into marrying Van for the sake of studio optics, making their union less a love story and more a strategic move in the studio's game of reputation management. The couple had a daughter, Skylar, and Van adopted Eve's 2 sons from her previous marriage, but the relationship was far from harmonious. Van was often withdrawn, emotionally unavailable, and deeply affected by his childhood traumas and the pressures of hiding his true self. As whispers about Van's private life continued, stories began to emerge about a secret gay Hollywood scene hidden behind closed doors. Parties in Beverly Hills mansions and Laurel Canyon hideaways allowed actors to express themselves freely, if only temporarily. Van was reportedly a regular at such gatherings, mingling with names like Roddy McDowell, Anthony Perkins, Farley Granger, and Rock Hudson. One especially provocative rumor claimed he had once spent a night with 8 actors. Whether true or not, the story highlighted the double life he was forced to live. Publicly, Van was the embodiment of mid-century American virtue. Privately, he sought a moment of authenticity in a world that refused to accept him as he was. His personal struggles only intensified over time. In 1961, while performing in The Music Man in London, Van reportedly began a romantic relationship with a young male dancer in the cast. This relationship marked the beginning of the end of his marriage to Eve, who later accused him of leaving her for a man. Her son, Ned Wynn, confirmed that Van had abandoned the family to pursue the relationship, a painful yet revealing admission that Van, at last, might have been trying to live honestly. The couple officially divorced in 1968, but Van's emotional wounds ran deep. He remained estranged from his daughter, Skylar, and lived the rest of his life largely alone. In the decades that followed, Van continued to work in television and on stage, appearing in shows like Murder, She Wrote, The Love Boat, and in productions of La Cage AUX Falls. Though he never regained the level of fame he enjoyed in the 1940s and 50s, he remained a respected figure in the industry, admired for his professionalism, versatility, and enduring charm. Eventually retiring in the 1990s, Van settled in New York City, living quietly in a penthouse overlooking the East River. His later years were spent in solitude, far removed from the glitz and pressure of Hollywood. As his health declined, he moved to a care facility in Nyack, New York, where he passed away on December 12, 2008, at the age of 92. His death, like many aspects of his life, was quiet and private. He was cremated as per his or his family's wishes and left no public heirs. Van Johnson's legacy is complex. He was a star shaped by a system that valued image over truth, who brought light to millions during dark times, but lived much of his own life in emotional and personal confinement. The image he projected on screen, sunny, sincere, endlessly cheerful, masked a man burdened by secrets and scars. And yet, his story is not one of tragedy alone. It is also a story of resilience, of someone who, despite the odds, managed to carve out a career, touch the lives of fans around the world, and leave behind a body of work that continues to inspire. Thanks to the generosity of Lucille Ball, who saw his potential when no one else did, Van had the chance to rise from obscurity to fame. And though he never fully escaped the limitations imposed on him by his era, his life serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost behind the Hollywood dream. Whether the wildest stories about his private life are fact or fiction matters less than what they represent. The yearning for freedom in a world that demanded conformity. Van Johnson should be remembered not just for his roles, but for his courage in enduring a world that rarely made space for authenticity. His legacy, like the man himself, is full of contradictions, brilliance, and humanity. Van Johnson's story, while marked by box office success and public adoration, is ultimately a portrait of quiet suffering under the glossy surface of mid-century Hollywood. His public persona as the sunny, clean-cut boy next door, often seen laughing in Technicolor musicals or playing noble soldiers in wartime dramas, was constructed by MGM with clinical precision. The studio had a vested interest in maintaining the image of its stars, and Van, with his all-American looks, gentle voice, and open demeanor, was an ideal canvas. He was a perfect poster boy for wartime patriotism, an avatar of optimism for a country grappling with anxiety, grief, and uncertainty. Yet, within this carefully maintained persona was a man riddled with insecurities and forced into hiding essential aspects of his identity. The deep emotional wound left by his mother's abandonment, never truly resolved, remained a recurring source of pain throughout his life. He rarely spoke of her, but when he did, it was often in terms of silence and absence. In a rare interview, he mentioned that her leaving felt like a breath disappearing from the room, sudden, cold, and final. That loss haunted him, shaping both his intense need to be loved and his crippling fear of rejection. These psychological scars, compounded by his father's disdain and emotional abuse, laid the groundwork for Van's later struggles with intimacy and vulnerability. Fame became both a validation and a mask. For Van, performing was not simply a job. It was survival, an act of self-preservation in a world where being different could cost everything. His marriage to Eve Abbott-Wynn, while publicly presented as a love match, was more accurately a performance orchestrated for damage control. Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s was merciless toward anything that deviated from its rigid moral code, especially in matters of sexuality. The Production Code Administration and gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons functioned as unofficial enforcers of public morality, wielding the power to ruin careers with single insinuation. In that environment, actors who were gay or bisexual were often coerced into lavender marriages, heterosexual unions arranged to dispel suspicion and secure career longevity. Van's situation was no different. The marriage to Eve may have kept scandal at bay, but it came at an enormous personal cost. Though they shared moments of friendship and even affection, the marriage lacked emotional and physical intimacy. Eve, a sharp and complex woman in her own right, later described a union as lonely in the most ironic way. Because you're not alone, but you are. They maintained appearances, attended premieres arm in arm, and posed for family photos that painted a picture of post-war domestic bliss. But inside the home, Van remained distant, often retreating into his own world, sometimes locking himself in a room for hours on end, listening to music, writing letters he never sent, or simply staring out the window. Despite this isolation, Van maintained his reputation as one of the nicest men in Hollywood. He was famously polite, unfailingly generous, and rarely if ever involved in scandal. Fellow actors recalled his kindness on set, his willingness to support younger performers, and his tireless work ethic. Yet, even those close to him sensed an impenetrable barrier, a quiet sadness that lingered behind the smile. His friend and co-star June Allison once said he was sunshine on screen, but there was a storm just behind his eyes. That inner conflict grew heavier as the years passed. By the late 1950s, Van's youthful screen persona began to lose relevance. The public, once hungry for escapist fare and idealized masculinity, had begun to crave complexity, realism, and rebellion. Traits embodied by a new generation of actors like Marlon Brando, James Dean, and Paul Newman. Studios also began shedding long-term contracts, and Van, like many of his peers, found himself adrift in an industry that no longer needed him as it once had. His roles became fewer, and often he was cast in supporting parts or ensemble films that failed to capture the magic of his earlier work. Still, he worked steadily, pivoting to television and stage with the same commitment he had shown during his peak. He brought warmth to every guest spot, often stealing scenes with just a few lines and his trademark sincerity. But perhaps Van's greatest transformation came not on screen, but in his personal journey toward authenticity. In the mid-1960s, while performing The Music Man in London, he fell in love with a male dancer, a relationship that, while never publicly confirmed by Van himself, was acknowledged by family members and close friends. This relationship marked a turning point. For the first time, Van allowed himself to feel openly, to experience a kind of emotional intimacy that had long been forbidden. His stepson, Ned Wynn, later reflected in his memoir that Van was never the same after that. He laughed more easily. He smiled in a way that seemed real. Though the relationship was not without challenges, it effectively ended his already fragile marriage and estranged him from his daughter. It offered him a glimpse of peace. Still, the societal constraints of the time made full public acceptance impossible. Van never came out, never spoke openly about his sexuality, and remained evasive in interviews even in his old age. It was a silence born not of shame, but of survival. The world he had grown up in had told him that to be himself was to risk everything: his work, his reputation, his very safety. And so he continued to perform on stage, on screen, and in life. In the 1980s and 1990s, as attitudes toward sexuality began to shift, Van continued working, albeit at a slower pace. He joined touring productions of Showboat and Guys and Dolls, and even returned to Broadway in La Cage AUX Falls, where he played the conservative father of a gay son, a role steeped in irony given Van's own life. Reviews praised the performance, Noting the subtle emotion, he brought to scenes that mirrored his own concealed truth. Offstage, Van lived a quiet, mostly solitary life. He maintained a few close friendships and kept correspondence with fans, some of whom had followed him since his earliest days in Hollywood. Those who visited him in his final years described him as gracious, reflective, and at times, surprisingly candid about his past. He spoke of missed opportunities, of the loneliness that fame could not cure, and of the deep gratitude he felt for those who had supported him, even if they never truly knew him. He never reconciled with his daughter Skylar, who declined public comment even after his death. But she, too, has acknowledged in past interviews the complexity of their relationship, shaped by forces larger than either of them could control. When Van Johnson died on December 12, 2008, obituaries celebrated his films, his charm, and his role as a symbol of wartime America. But beneath those accolades lay a deeper story. A man who navigated one of the most treacherous landscapes of 20th century fame with grace and dignity, even as he had parts of himself to survive. His life was a contradiction. A public figure known for sincerity who had to be inauthentic to protect his livelihood, a star adored by millions who often felt deeply alone, a performer who brought joy to others while wrestling with his own sorrow. Yet in many ways, Van's life also represents a quiet triumph. He endured, he adapted, and in his own restrained way, he pushed back against a system that tried to define him. He found love, even if fleeting. He touched countless lives through his work. And today, as audiences rediscover his films, there's a growing recognition not just of his talent, but of his courage. The world he inhabited is slowly being replaced by one more accepting, more nuanced, and more willing to embrace the complexities of identity. And in that world, Van Johnson's story is more relevant than ever. A reminder of the cost of silence, the strength of resilience, and the enduring power of a gentle heart navigating a hard world. In a world where image was everything, Van Johnson became a masterpiece of illusion. Every camera flash, every studio press release, every carefully arranged date told the public who he was, or rather, who he was supposed to be: the affable boy next door, the wartime sweetheart, the Hollywood golden boy. But beneath that perfectly polished surface, Van carried a quiet sadness, the kind that comes from constantly hiding your truth. His rumored relationships, the studio-arranged partnerships, the silences in interviews, they weren't just choices. They were survival tactics in an industry that punished honesty with exile. He wasn't alone, of course. There were others like him, stars who laughed on screen while quietly suffocating behind closed doors. But Van made it look effortless. That was his genius and his tragedy. As time passed and the golden era faded, so did the walls he once built so carefully. In private, he showed glimpses of authenticity, a man who loved deeply, but could never be fully known in public. And in that vulnerability, his true brilliance shone, not just as a Hollywood legend, but as a symbol of resilience, navigating a world that only loved half of who he was. Van Johnson's story isn't just Hollywood history. It's a quiet revolution, a man who spent his life performing roles written by others, finally finding flashes of truth in stolen moments of love and solitude. He gave America the comfort it craved during war, but bore the loneliness it never saw. His charm wasn't just talent, it was armor. And yet, behind all of it, he remained kind, generous, and full of quiet grace. If this story moved you, or made you see an old star in a new light, let us know in the comments. We read every one. And if you're drawn to untold stories like this, hit subscribe. We have more hidden chapters of Hollywood history coming soon.